Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your Excellency, Dr. Abdulatif Rashid, the Chairman of the Gulf Research Center, thank you, my friend, once again, for giving me the chance to return for the fifth occasion to this beautiful city to say a few words about some of our common concerns. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. In preparing for today, I looked back at my previous 4 talks. Reading them showed me clearly how the global and regional situation has worsened. Old tensions remain, and new challenges abound. 2 things struck me. Firstly, the optimism with which I spoke in 2012 about Yemen and my hopes for success of the GCC initiative. And secondly, the pessimistic tones of my speech last year, in which I called for a total realignment of thought to break the cycle of regional instability. In seeking solutions, my parting words were, do not be afraid to think what in the past would have been the unthinkable. So where are we today? Daesh continues as the single greatest challenge for us all. Syria, amid unabated devastation and bloodshed, awaits a solution. The stubborn violence in Libya is ongoing. The so-called Middle East peace process is all but dead. Uncertainties over Iran's destabilizing ambitions linger. Yemen is in the throes of a serious internal conflict. Our region continues to be the single worst breeding ground for harboring extremism and terrorism, and at the same time, the greatest importer of foreign fighters. Add to this the steep drop in oil prices, which has done nothing to enhance stability. Not a happy story, is it? And yet, in a strange sort of way, within all these dynamics, the unthinkable has been thought. There has been a clarification on certain issues. For instance, the initial stages of a final agreement on the Iran nuclear program, which is probably a good possible political solution for this thorny issue, has been signed. The unlikely alliances countering Daesh are bonding more closely. The full impact of extremism will force the global community into a more cohesive counter stance. And lastly, while the situation in Yemen is worse in terms of violence than it was last summer, at least something is being done about it. It is these topics, the macro of nuclear deals, Daesh and extremism, and the micro of Yemen, that we will consider. On the Iranian side, as you will all know, we in the GCC have always been wary of any agreement which is not inclusive and does not take account of malign Iranian regional aspirations and intrusions into other nations' affairs. All of us should be concerned that such long-held Iranian ambitions might prevail as more finance becomes available to fund these activities. In particular, we are concerned that vested interests and the lower-end benefits of trade prove so tempting to international partners that sanction preconditions are weakened and eroded. Of course, we hope this will not occur, and that the United States and others responsible for locking back sanctions will uphold their commitments. In order to reassure us on this issue and also to consider ways of enhancing cooperation, President Obama invited a top-level delegation from the GCC states to meet him at Camp David last May. Most of you will have read the joint statement, which followed the meeting. But more importantly, I hope you have looked at the annex to the statement, which articulates the details and gives guidance on follow-up procedures and ongoing consultation. All this is happening, and we do feel some reassurance. Moreover, GCC foreign ministers and US Secretary of State Kerry meeting in Doha earlier this month reaffirmed their rejection of Iran's support of terrorism and destabilizing activities throughout our region, and affirmed their determination to counter Iranian interferences. Nevertheless, the potential consequences have forced on us the necessity not only to think ahead, but also independently. With this in mind, you will have observed the formalizing of relationships with regional partners on matters of defense and security. Also within the GCC, we have taken measures to ensure that our joint capabilities and potential are maximized. Interoperability of doctrine, communications, and equipment is now at the heart of our vision for security and stability. This is a sensible measure of any time, but we feel that it is particularly important now as the power balance within the Middle East is being reshaped. There is nothing alarmist in what we are doing. Rather, we are preparing for the worst while hoping, we are preparing for the worst while hoping and working hard for the best. Let me now turn from nuclear to the question of violent extremism, which is possibly the greatest global and regional threat. This threat had its birth in the chaotic vacuum following the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the more recent civil war in Syria. Lawless spaces were created and soon filled with groups of varying loyalties and beliefs. That is, until Daesh entered the arena, swept all aside, and announced itself in June last year as a worldwide caliphate. Unusually for any extremist or terrorist organization, it also conquered and claimed land and then proclaimed so-called boundaries. To counter this threat, various alliances were formed of mostly unlikely allies, including, I am happy to say, the GCC. Reclaiming Daesh territory will not be easy, but equally, I have no doubt that once the various partners in the alliance work in a truly coordinated fashion, that Daesh can and will be defeated militarily and ultimately expelled from their self-proclaimed home. The recent entrance of Turkey will make a large difference, particularly in undermining Daesh support and reinforcing activities. But what then? We will still have huge challenges to surmount. For instance, the constitution of a truly inclusive national government in Iraq, which accommodates all the components of the Iraqi people. The assertion of Iraq's sovereignty in the midst of intrusive influences by its eastern neighbor. The flourishing of extremist sectarian discourse and identities. The dispersal of other rebel groups, to name but a few. My point is that the current threat grew from the chaos following a previous military operation. We now need to ensure that the failure is not repeated following the aftermath of another successful military operation against Daesh. Looking slightly wider, I believe that the Assad regime's days are numbered, and it is a matter of time before there will be some form of regime change. This in itself will cause complications. Think for instance, of the competing interests of some neighboring nations. Whatever happens, a transitional phase in Syria will be closely linked to any military endgame concerning Daesh. The handling of these events needs to be considered together and not in isolation. And quite apart from the political ramification of unlikely allies no longer having a single and common purpose, there will be major humanitarian and reconstruction issues to be resolved. I wonder if we are forward-looking enough and giving this matter the attention it deserves. I would be interested in hearing your views. Those are some of my thoughts on the military fight against Daesh. But what about the equally serious problem of the multifaceted phenomena of extremism? Physical borders and boundaries can be crossed and regained, and land retaken. But it is infinitely more difficult to cross over and regain the minds of those to whom violent fanaticism is, for whatever reason, ingrained. There are those who say that once the mindset is in place, it is almost impossible to change. They say that an idea cannot be killed. I am no expert in thought processes, but the one thing we must try to do is to prevent indoctrination. I got it. Indoctrination from taking place to begin with. We must ensure that our citizens, and particularly our youth, learn right from wrong, both in religious and secular sense. Our education programs, peer pressures, and above all, family upbringing must all come into play. Needless to say, this is a priority for the GCC. We all know that those recruited are not solely from the poor or ill-educated. Many recruits have university educations. Many of those who come from Europe, America, Australia, and other first world nations have been given fair opportunities, and yet they volunteer. Consider the many recent incidents which have taken place in the West, Australia, Africa, and Asia, caused by homegrown extremism. It is a disease which is about to run out of control. Each affected nation is doing what it can individually to lessen the dangers within its own communities and borders. But they are swatting mosquitoes, not attacking the breeding grounds. This is our common task, with Muslims having an essential role to play. We continually say the extremist preaching is fallacy, a misinterpretation which bears no relation to the true meanings of Islam. And yet the creed, the ethos, and the beliefs of the extremists drives them to ever greater outrages. Surely if we cannot kill an idea, we must do more to correct it. But as we think of ways to do this, it is vital that we cooperate closely and coordinate ideas and activities globally. Last year, I mentioned that Saudi Arabia has for a decade been calling for the establishment of an international center for countering terrorism. Today, we are proud that the late King Abdullah's vision has materialized. by the recent establishment of the United Nations Center for Countering Terrorism, with a Saudi pledge of $110 million. This 21-nation members center has an advisory board, which is directed by the Saudi ambassador to the United Nations. It is certainly a welcome development, which bears witness to the fact that the GCC is a global catalyst in the fight against terrorism. I do feel that amongst its other roles, this center could act as a much-needed focal point for research, exchange of ideas and knowledge, and coordination of efforts into the disruption of the process of radicalization. We, the GCC, look forward to work with the center in fulfilling such a non-contentious role. I will now turn from the general to the specific and say a few words on the situation in Yemen. I do so because I personally have been involved at every stage since 2011, and you may wish to ask me questions later on, but also because that unfortunate nation has become, in many ways, a microcosm of many of our current challenges. It's very close to my heart, Yemen. First, a few words to bring you up to date. Most of you will be fully aware of the struggles prior to the GCC initiative and the subsequent success of the transitional government to move forward the political processes. So much so that the citizens of Yemen were only months away from adopting a new constitution and holding national elections. At that point, in the fall of 2014, destabilizing forces within the nation, encouraged verbally and with weaponry from outside, began to agitate until in the early months of this year, a full-blown insurgency was taking place, leading President Hadi and his government to take refuge abroad. It was at this point that Saudi Arabia and an alliance of Arab and other nations began to back the legitimate government and its supporters. In April 2015, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2216 under Chapter 7, calling the rebels to withdraw from all occupied cities and districts and surrender all stolen state weaponry and an end to hostilities in order to allow a Yemeni-led peaceful transition to resume, according to the GCC initiative and national dialogue outcomes. Since then, despite temporary ceasefires and half-hearted talks, the military situation has swayed backwards and forwards. But now the legitimate government and the loyalists, backed by the alliance, are clearly in a dominant position, so much so that elements of the government have returned. United Nations Resolution 2216 is very clear about legitimacy and ending violence, but so were the preceding resolutions, which provided Yemen with hope through a transitional government. They did not prevent a relapse. How can we be sure that 2216 will be different? To me, I believe the situation will stabilize and that the transitional government will resume its legitimate role. This time, I hope, backed by an alliance of true friends and of true friends of the people of Yemen, that internal opposition will follow the democratic process and external influences will find it much more difficult to succeed. Certainly, our future approach will be far more proactive than in the past. Here again, I would like to think that any subversive foreign influence in Yemen will be considered in the context of sanctions. We cannot continue to have United Nations Security Council resolutions blatantly ignored. To me, as I come to the end of this talk, the common theme throughout is proactivity and forward-thinking. There are not many who would disagree that it was a lack of foresight which allowed the regional balance of power to shift so dramatically in the chaos following the aftermath of 2003 invasion of Iraq. Arguably, also, the GCC and the international community took their eyes off the ball, leading directly to near disaster in Yemen. This must not be repeated. We hope that the Iranian nuclear agreement will succeed and will make the region a safer place. We hope also that post-sanctions, Iran will use wealth for stability and not instability, thus freeing the region not just from nuclear, but also from more conventional ambitions and threats. The GCC will cooperate with all parties and do all we can to ensure this happens. Similarly, the endgame for the Syrian regime and the military defeat of Daesh will occur one day. We must consider these events as an entity and think now of how this transition should be managed while accommodating the various and conflicting interests. It cannot be left to chance, or we will be caught out, and once again, another vacuum will be created. Finally, and as importantly as anything I have said so far, the international community in general, and Muslims in particular, must, as first priority, be proactive and coordinate global activities that are forward-thinking and imaginative in considering how to counter the extremists' mind. Thank you.